that really need to come down, that are costly to operate. And so the engineering build is an example of that. We've got a science building that we're hoping to get some early work done on in this biennial request. And then finally, I would note in the capital budget is that particularly as we've reduced the size of our overall request to reflect what we think we can get, what we're asking for now is really integrated with what we are thinking the future might look like in the next 2 biennia. So if you fund some renovation in East Lake Hall this biennia, that's going to allow us to move some people out of Heald Hall so that we can take that down and ultimately build a new science building down the road. And so I think that level of integration and foresight is also being appreciated. Yeah.
I'll just say from a faculty perspective, boy, is it nice to see the things that are run down not necessarily getting the maintenance they need replaced. I mean, it just really boosts morale in a way that you maybe don't appreciate from where you're at. But boy, when you're walking through stuff and it's broken, it's not being used, it's nice. I applaud the decision to start to replace and upgrade things that we've got rather than just going somewhere, take a new corner and build something new. I really think this is a good decision from the morale thing, which you can't measure, but at least from where I feel, I think this is choices.
I very much appreciate that. And can I just say, maybe ask for a little bit of understanding too. There have been times when we've taken visitors through, lots of times they'll come for the ribbon cuttings and things like that, but they don't often get to see some of our workspaces that are inadequate. It may not surprise you that sometimes faculty members are not super excited to show off the space that they're working in.
Yeah.
So, but it's really important that we do that. So thank you for that. And I would also note that a lot of the spaces that we're talking about, these are not 30-year-old buildings. These are 50, 60, 70-year-old buildings. The state has gotten its money's worth out of these things. And in some cases, it's just time for them to come down.
Chris, yes, I was just going to say that Regent Blankenship has a question for you.
First, I'll do a comment. Welcome, Judy. I heard your voice. Sorry, I'm not there to say hello. So Chris, back to human capital, and we're asking for cost of living, staff, and the like. But I guess my question would go back to the president or or Daryl. Is that enough? Or it's one thing to say we want to train more nurses, but it's another to pay people enough to want to teach nursing and keep them available to us when they can make a lot more money working in nursing. So are those two roads lining up? I guess is that enough to ask for?
So I'm happy to field that one. So I have no question that if we went to deans in all of our colleges or department heads and so forth, is it enough? The answer is going to be no. They can always use more. I think the challenge that we have, and I'm going to talk in a few minutes about the fiscal lay of the land, but there's the combination of kind of what we need and also what is the art of the possible. I think so if I could just talk about the compensation, the broad compensation enhancement for university-wide that we're asking for, the 4% in the first year of the biennium, 3% in the second, that replicates what the major state employee unions have negotiated with the governor's office. And so that's really going to be the high water mark. And our hope is to kind of, to ride those coattails a bit and get a COLA that's implementable. But again, with the nursing, the objective here was to bring our current faculty and staff are at about 25th percentile of peer institutions and practicing nurses with similar degrees, and we're hoping to bring that up to 50th 50th percentile. I hope the policymakers will look at that and say, we're not reaching for the moon here. We're trying to be practical and make some meaningful improvement. You know, could we use more? Absolutely.
Chris, if you could, on that same vein, talk about capital and how we formulate our ask, not the details of the building projects, but you know, we always hear from, I hear from alumni sometimes, well, why aren't you guys asking for more? And there's a real strategy around how WSU makes its capital ask. That's not just internally what the things are, but our total number. And we actually received some really positive kudos from the legislative colleagues that, hey, you guys do a really great job of putting this together and giving us something that's a stretch, but not something that's so much of a stretch that we go, this is ridiculous. So
Sure.
maybe talk a little bit about that, because it's very purposeful.
That's right. So, you know, one of the things that happened, I'm going to say this was in the 2009, maybe 07, 09 timeframe. We just had, higher ed had an amazing year in the capital budget. WSU got over $200 million in support for the capital budget. And that kind of became our new, like, great, we're going to build our budget requests around that. Well, then we go into Great Recession and we basically got a cash only capital budget, and we go down to, you know, I mean, just a fraction of that. And so, but we kind of never really adjusted that benchmark. And so, you know, we ended up with a number of projects in future years that got off track because, you know, a budget writer would say, you know, they asked for more than we have to give them. And I see this project here, but I also see this project down the list that costs less. So let's go grab that one. And that became a real problem, as we had several projects that kind of got off schedule. So we have readjusted how much we're asking for based on what we realistically think we should get, just to prevent that dynamic where we're ultimately competing with ourselves. And this last time around, you know, we ended up getting pretty much everything that we asked for. Not always at the levels we wanted, particularly as it relates to minor works funding for deferred maintenance, but basically everything got funded. And you know, I'm not going to name names, but when we're out meeting with people, we do get critiques of everyone else's capital budget request, and they're oftentimes not flattering when they're so right now the state has got about $7.2 billion in requests and $4.2 billion in bonding authority. And so one of the things that happened right after everybody sent in their requests is OFM added it all up and sent it around. Just FYI, this is the situation we're looking at. So
quick question on the again on infrastructure. I noticed there's a line for the ongoing maintenance and operations for the Vancouver Life Sciences building. So is that for an increase in what they gave us in M&O, or they didn't give us anything for M&O?
So we will not request M&O until the biennium that the building is completed arrives, and they are aware. They are aware of the timeline, not just for our buildings, but all state buildings that are coming online, and there'll be the expectation that M&O will be provided. And even in the Great Recession, when we had buildings come online, we got maintenance and operation for new buildings. It was not at a rate that was where we needed it.
It never is it?
And well, but we've done okay in the past several biennia. But you know, one of the things you need to be aware of is that everybody gets the same rate. You know, so it's not like our project is going to go outperform, you know, the Department of Enterprise Services new building or something like that. So I put that in there because it's important to recognize that, you know, when we put up a new building, we still need to go get M&O for it. I think our last challenge really was with Collaboration Hall at the Tri-Cities campus, you know, and making everyone aware that that's a thing that needs to happen. But it gets funded at the maintenance level, and it's grouped in with a lot of other maintenance level things we'll talk about in a minute. It's not that we need to worry about, you know, the Vancouver delegation got to rush to make sure that that's there. You know, it's going to be there. We just need to hope that it's at a rate and that they can afford a rate that is suitable to operate the new buildings.
How does that work with public-private partnerships? So the state provides partial funding, and part comes from the community.
So that's a conversation we're going to need to have. So it's very clear, and we have asked several times, that the state is not going to provide M&O for buildings that the state did not fund. So, and WSU has several buildings that fit that.
Has several buildings like.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. But I'm going to say even new buildings, right? The Spark building was not a state funded project. The Culture Center was not a state funded project, even though they serve a state purpose. And we have asked for M&O anyway. But we have gotten questions from time to time from legislators to just say, well, why do you even ask us for money? Why don't you just have all of your buildings privately funded? And it's like, well, because the state doesn't provide M&O for, I mean, first of all, if we could, we'd certainly do more. But the state provides a disincentive because they will only provide M&O for state funded projects. So this engineering project is going to be, an interesting conversation, because that's going to be half and half.
Yeah.
Heather, you had a question.
Yeah, I had a question. So with the governor's concentration on climate and I think really probably climate and healthcare being sort of two of his big thrusts going into this next time period, is there anything that we are going to be proposing or any kind of thinking that you've got around climate as a strategic emphasis of ours that we might be asking for funding for?
Are you talking in the capital budget or operating budget or both?
Seems like an opportunity to help him achieve his agenda.
Sure. So I'm going to choose my words carefully on this one.
Fine.
So there is what we bring to the legislature in terms of priorities and so forth. We also are frequently given assignments. Examples would be in the 2022 legislative session, we were tasked to work on, to lead a few work groups to develop legislation around catalytic converter theft and a few other things. And some small scale research on on some environmental issues. I anticipate that we may also see some assignments in this coming budget that get to what you are speaking to. Some assignments we get are really small and modest. Others are more sizable.
So I'll be less cautious than Chris was. The governor has asked us in particular to put a proposal together around some things in the climate space. Chris and his team are working with one of our chancellors and put together a very aggressive proposal. And we want to always be seen if it aligns with where the university wants to go. And any governor says, would you all be willing to step into this space? To me, we always want to be willing to step into that particular space. So I would say, Heather, we'll be able to say more in the next few weeks, but I think I'll just put it this way. I think the board's going to be very pleased. Is that, I didn't go too far over the line.
No, you did great.
So yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah.
And along the same lines, but not topical for today, but just as a question about when we'll talk about this with Senator Murray ascending even further into the leadership
Hierarchy.
when will we talk about federal strategy next?
So I handle all of the state level.
I realize that,
yeah,
which is why I said this is not
yeah.
today's discussion.
We'll put it on the agenda. Happy to do so. Glenda would do that. And, even though we've had some budgetary challenges over the last several years, one area we have continued to invest in is our government relations team. And we've added people and expertise to make sure that, we may be in the next 2 years in such a great position as a state, given where our elected representatives on both sides of the aisle are going to be. We've got a 2-year federal window here that is significant for us, and we want to make sure that we, utilize that as much as possible. So I think we'll work on scheduling something so you get something similar from the federal team as well.
Great.
Chris, last thing I just want to mention, just for the board's sake, is one of the other strengths I think we bring to the table is we are always very upfront with elected officials about our priorities. It's easy for us to, it's much easier to say, oh, all these things are equally important. And then they walk away and say, well, do you have a priority or not? We list the cost of living adjustment with every conversation, at least Chris and I have been involved with, and our chancellors and our team, is compensation is our number one priority. We want to do all these things, but if we had to choose one, this is where we think it's the most important. And I think, again, most of the elected officials really appreciate the fact that we are willing to prioritize and not just say everything is equally important. I don't know if you want to comment on that
Yeah.
at all or not.
I talk with my colleagues all the time about this challenge. I mean, if you have 10 priorities, you don't have any priorities. And so we have to be really targeted in what we advance to the legislature. And, we'll talk about fiscal lay of the land in a moment, but in July, you don't exactly know what the economic climate is going to be in April when the budget's being approved. And so, I'm a hockey fan, they say in hockey, you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate to where it's going. And to the degree that you can kind of, predict where's the economy going, that kind of helps drives and size, maybe what you're going to be asking for. But what you can't do is just come in with 10 items which some entities do. And it's a good way to end up with a budget that funds everybody else's priorities, but not your priorities. I want to talk a little bit about engagement in our advocacy campaigns. We talk with policymakers and staff, but I just also want to note that we spend a good amount of time engaging third-party validators who can be the most credible voices to articulate the value proposition that our asks deliver. The best example really is the community organizations that we work with that will put items that we advance to them that are relevant to their communities on their community agenda. So, Greater Spokane Incorporated in Spokane, here in Vancouver, it would be the triumvirate of Identity, Clark County, the Vancouver Chamber, and the Columbia River Economic Development Commission, and so forth, and really get our items on the community agenda, which legislators, some of them have talked about, they cut it out and they put it on their wall in their office, which is great. I want them to see our stuff on that list. But we also work with industry groups and trade associations that may take an interest in some of the individual things that we're working on, either in the operating budget or the capital budget. I also want to give you a little bit of a flavor as I've previewed about the fiscal lay of the land in Washington right now. The state of Washington has two councils that are responsible for establishing the core assumptions that budget writers will use in building their budgets. One of them approves assumptions for how much revenue the state's going to have, and the other develops assumptions for demand for entitlement services like K-12 and a lot of human services, money that has to be spent. And those kind of core pieces of information put together kind of give legislators an idea of how much money they really have available. And, some things you really don't have to decide on. You have to pay debt service, right? But whether you do a program enhancement or not, you need to know how much flexibility you have. In other states, the legislature itself develops these assumptions. And you can imagine, particularly in legislatures that are controlled by one party, that the assumptions that can be manipulated to drive particular outcomes. And so in our state, and I like to call out good government when I see it, in our state, we have two bipartisan councils with equal representation from all four legislative caucuses, plus executive staff such as the state treasurer and the director of the Office of Financial Management, who make these, who take recommendations in the case of the Economic Revenue Forecast Council from the state's chief economist and approve these assumptions. These are bipartisan votes. I've been in the legislative environment for 24 years. I can recall one time when there was a single no vote on a motion to accept the forecast. The spin that happens afterwards may be different, but everybody has the same information about revenues and required expenditures going in. We had tomorrow at noon, we're going to get a new revenue forecast. The governor will use that forecast to build the operating budget he'll produce before Christmas. The final revenue forecast will occur in the late February, early March timeframe. The legislature will use that. So when I talked about skate to where the puck is going, we've got basically 3.5 months for the economic landscape to get better or get worse. We always hope it gets better. And tomorrow we'll get a bit of an idea of what the governor has to deal with in developing his budget. So what did we learn in the September forecast? So the first thing I'd note is the September forecast was produced literally one day after the deadline for state agencies to submit their budget requests to OFM. And then we got the September forecast, and the biggest thing that you're going to note is the flattening of revenues in the period that we really care about, this 23-25 biennium that we're about to enter into. You can see all of the growth that we experienced coming out of the Great Recession. The vast majority of that is natural economic growth. I will say, with the benefit of hindsight, that some of those numbers are also bolstered by policy decisions the legislature made, i.e., new tax increases to fund new programs, including some higher ed programs. But the vast majority of that growth is really the result of economic growth. But you can see really the extraordinary growth we've seen in the last 2 years, 13%, 11%. Now we're really going to flatten 0.7, 1.4. And of course, again, we'll get an update on this tomorrow, although I wouldn't expect a dramatic departure from this. And so the state's going to have, a bit less new revenue to deal with than it's had in the past. The reason for the flattening will not be surprising to you. Inflation concerns, reducing purchasing power, perhaps driving consumer behavior. The September forecast did include an assumption that inflation eases next year. Rising interest rates, the forecast did assume some of the interest rate increases we've seen, but not all. Continued supply chain challenges, cooling housing market and its effect on real estate excise tax returns. And to tell you, just so that you know that austerity is really coming, even cannabis revenues are flattening. And that's really kind of for the first time. But I do want to, I want to be important to call out here, as of this hour, the state is projected to have about $65 billion in the next biennium. That's about $2 billion more than it currently has. So we're talking about slow growth, not no growth. And so this is not catastrophic in the context of a $65 billion state budget. However, I also want to note that if you've got, $2 billion more, remember that you've got maintenance level costs that are going to partially eat into that. So that's the increased costs of providing healthcare to state employees. That's the increased cost to the state of a higher minimum wage, which will grow again, and a number of other maintenance level costs. And then in addition to that, I mentioned the collective bargaining agreements that the state has negotiated with state employee unions. And again, we hope to ride the coattails of that. When you kind of lop all of that together, the reality is that our state is probably looking at a small budget deficit at the moment. But I would also even hedge there to say the legislature and the State Office of Financial Management employs a great number of really talented staff whose job it is to determine creative ways to stretch the state dollar further. And so I would predict that if this forecast were to hold even in the February, March timeframe, that you might see some austerity, but I also anticipate that in addition to COLAs, they'd find a way to do some small amount of new spending on new programs. We have been told to prepare for a budget that may fund COLAs and not a whole lot else, but we also are aware of other new initiatives that are being developed by legislators and other policymakers. And then once again, regardless of what you see tomorrow and in the forecast in the governor's budget, we still got 3.5 months for things to get better, or God forbid, get worse. And I should also note too, one final thing on this, as we're talking about, I mentioned earlier, our ask around COLAs and the challenges we've had with our funding formula. One of the things that we've been explaining to them to articulate the problem is that the state in 2022 said that we're providing funding sufficient to provide 3.25% increases, and this is for everybody, including higher ed. Well, the reality is we know that they didn't provide sufficient resources, and what we were able to do was more like 2.5%. And the only reason we were able to do 2.5 is because we did levy a reduction across all units. And so it's important on a couple levels to articulate not only that the funding formula needs help, but secondly, just that they understand that we're not tone deaf here. We understand what's going on at the state level. We're attuned to that, and we're and we have demonstrated our own austerity. Before I wrap here, we spent a lot of time talking about kind of June through December, WSU's priorities and the things we're working on and excited about. Then we get to January and we get to talk about everybody else's priorities. And so we spend a lot of time in January and February in particular, working on a series of bills. I mentioned the pre-filing begins December 1. And what you're looking at here is just a little bit of a smorgasbord of the kinds of issues that we will deal with, not necessarily all of those in every legislative session, but over the course of time. And you never know, what you're going to find yourself in the middle of. But I just wanted you all to be aware of the kinds of things that we, end up spending a lot of time negotiating. I would think, I would note last year, WSU took a real lead on negotiating the anti-hazing legislation went through. That was, as you can imagine, something like that requires a lot of time to get a lot of really important details right. And so, while we will do as much as we can. Kirk will come do Olympia, and maybe some of you will come for Regents and Trustees Day, and we'll talk about things we want. But just know behind the scenes, there's a whole suite of other issues that we're dealing with. And with that, I'm going to leave you with a fun fact, which is we're going to have an in-person legislative session in 2023, and 28% of the legislature will have not served in an in-person legislative session. Between those who were just elected and those elected 2 years ago, some of them may have come down for floor votes and things like that. It is a different environment when you have full hallways and people such as myself, standing outside waiting to walk people to their cars. For a quick word, it's a different environment, and so it's going to be interesting.
Chris, thank you. In several other Regents meetings, members of the board have, consistently said, we want to help. We want to help advance WSU's legislative agenda. Talk a little bit about how the board itself can support your team and what you do. Also, it's a very coordinated effort, and that's important to sort of also make sure that everybody, including me and others, work within that coordinated effort. So maybe a little bit on that.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I appreciate that. Our work is not always intuitive. I think, sometimes people think if you scream the loudest, you're the most successful, and that's really not as effective. The key word you use is coordinated, right? So everything we do is connected, whether I'm working with a member on a capital budget item, we may be, going great on a capital budget item, but maybe butting heads on another issue, and you just, no one else would really be aware of that. And so, we need to kind of be constantly involved or constantly aware that everything is connected. I think where Regents can particularly help is, and this is really probably more one-on-one conversations, but having Regents make cold calls is ultimately not helpful. But to the degree that you have relationships, and of course, many or most of you do, and some of them we've leaned on before, we may have a conversation about how you can help with a particular member, on a particular issue. But I think it's also important to recognize that if it's not coordinated, you might not be aware of a reason why a particular contact might not only not be helpful but counterproductive. So if you are interested in helping, and I suspect many of you are, we'd love to have maybe a one-on-one conversation with you about how that might happen. The second thing is, I mentioned earlier, we are going to try to reschedule an in-person Regents and Trustees Day. We've historically sent, maybe 3 regents that would appear with regents not only from the other public four-year universities, but also the community colleges, which has just been fantastic. And for a day of meetings and things like that. And that's always helpful. Those are the 2 things that I would note.
Chris, a question for you about the past election. Is it changing much of the makeup of who's going to be heading committees and things like that?
So I believe Colleen wants to do a little bit deeper dive in that at a future meeting, but I'll just tell you at a high level, it's really status quo in terms of, from our standpoint. There are going to be some changes that will be important to us on the margins and as it relates to particular issues. But from what we can see from here, and they're going to go through their own kind of committee elections and identify chairs and all that kind of stuff in the weeks to come. But from this vantage point, it doesn't look like we're going to see dramatic change. We might see the ranking Republican on one committee or another, become a ranking member on another committee and things like that. But at a high level, we're not looking at sweeping change. That's my presentation. Happy to entertain questions and conversation.
I was just going to ask, are there other comments or questions for Chris?
I have one. Chris, where are the discussions on mental health? Because there for a while in our state, that was just a huge issue. I mean, we got so many big issues. I'm not sure where that stacks up, but certainly that's an area where we can, as a university, make a major impact through our nursing program and medical school. And this, I'm not sure exactly how this plays into the new public health proposal, but there's a behavioral health component.
Right.
And so
it remains very high interest. Of course, when there's more money on the table, it's easier to kind of talk about, how we can tackle some of these things. It remains high level. It's going to be high level in the capital budget this year with looking at developing a new Western State Hospital, which is actually going to create some capacity challenges in the capital budget, but that's going to be a big discussion point there. I think the reality is our state needs so much more of so many things in terms of workforce. And mental health is at the very top. I would, you mentioned nursing, but I would really actually point to the social work proposal for the Tri-Cities campus. There's a broad, one of the things about an ask like that is you don't have to sell the problem statement. Everybody knows. And so, and yeah, the public health degree as well, scratches that itch a bit. It's just a matter of what are you going to be able to afford in the operating budget. But I would say nursing and social work are right at the top of let's say legislative interest, and that's not a coincidence those are the things on our agenda.
one of the reasons I ask is I know in the Tri-Cities, for many years, we have had a real shortage of psychiatrists.
Yeah.
We've also had a real shortage of psychiatric nurses who can also prescribe.
Right.
And with all the mental illness that we keep on finding more and more that it's out there, and it certainly speaks to the need
Yeah.
for more trained individuals.
So on the psychiatrist front, one of the things that I remind people is that psychiatry is one of the, your core disciplines in medicine, that in terms of primary care. Our medical school is going to produce a certain number of psychiatrists. And so that's an itch that medicine is already working to scratch. But, so are there other things that we can be doing? You mentioned psychiatric nurse practitioner program, which our College of Nursing offers. And one of the things I'd mentioned is, last year we asked for and received funding for a new psychiatric pharmacy program. Didn't exist in the state before, and we went in with University of Washington on that. We'll be standing up residents, I believe, in the summer of 23 in Yakima. I believe is where we're going to do that. So we are. Isn't that correct? Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
keep
you.
going.
So we're addressing that on a number of fronts, and would love to have some great news in the revenue forecast in February and March that makes things like social work really fundable. We did some meetings, test driving, even as going back to late May, early June, just to say, hey, are we on the right track? What do you think? And there's a lot of interest.
I'll just make a comment. This is an excellent presentation, Chris. This is a lot to celebrate, which is the result of significant amounts of work that you and your team, in partnership with our president, out meeting everywhere in every coffee shop with folks before we have to make the ask, when we have to make the ask. And I just really want to convey my appreciation, because we don't get to legislative priorities or to the successes without all of that work that happens over a much longer period of time when you're developing those relationships and creating those partnerships. So thank you for all that you do.
That's very greatly appreciated, and just want you to know how much we appreciate the support for our government relations unit. There have been notable investments made, as Kirk has noted, and that really helps us do those things that you talked about.
Are you looking forward to being back in person? I mean,
You know what? I am. And what I really can't wait for is to see all of the faces I haven't seen in 3 years that I'm not thinking about right now. Just 2 days ago, we were in a coffee shop here in Vancouver meeting with the legislator, and ran into a contract lobbyist that, we work with hadn't seen in 3 years, hadn't been top of mind. The Olympia is a lot like a playground. It operates on passing notes and 30-second hallway conversations, and you miss that when it's not there.
Yeah.
And our state has really missed it.
I would say too, most people may realize this, but Chris communicates on a very regular basis with his counterparts at the other public universities. And one of the fun things about being Olympia is we all wind up passing each other in the hallway. And sometimes, somebody from UW will say, oh, well, we just had a challenging visit with with this person, and this is on their list. And so that coordination back and forth and that ability to communicate, to me, we're all a team. We've got our own set of things that we want for our institution, for WSU, but it's important that we also work with the other folks in higher ed to advance higher ed in the state. So I've been in other states where it didn't work that way. It's really a strength for us that's a lot of times unrecognized. So Chris, thank you for your continued hard work in this space. So, and you were super positive today. So really well done.
I have a lot of bad news to deliver. Lots of times people want support for this or that, and there's limits to what the state can do. So I appreciate that critique. I'm trying.
Well, thank you, Chris. Much appreciated for all that you do, not only for the university, but also for our students, faculty, and staff. Much appreciated. So that concludes our 2 discussion items. And now I'd like to move on to our first introduction of an action item, the WSU proposed naming of the Ida Lou Anderson House. And I'd like to ask Provost and WSU Pullman Chancellor Elizabeth Chilton and Vice President for Finance and Administration, Stacy Pearson, to talk to us about this very exciting topic.
Go down there.
You can't just sit there. You got to be at the head of the table.
There we go.
Thank you for that introduction, John. And this is super exciting to be able to present this to all of you. Hopefully you had an opportunity to read in your packet some of the letters of support for this proposed renaming. Even though I knew all this information, seeing it all, reviewing it again before this, was getting verklempt. Or is that too much of a New York expression? So just to give you the highlights, and I'll also something that was not in that packet, which is also super exciting. So first of all, when my position was becoming clear, Kirk had actually recommended that it made sense for Michael and I to inhabit the residence, and immediately we started saying, well, then what are we going to call it? Makes sense, but both of us have been at previous institutions where the university would name the house either after some historical figure or after who donated the house, that it wasn't just called the president's house or the chancellor's house, it was named after someone. And so I suggested I explore who we might name this after. We have a lot of things named after presidents on the Pullman campus. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could find someone maybe who we don't already know about, but from the past, and who embodies the values of WSU today as we make this historic decision to change the name. And so I talked to Trevor Bond, who is a faculty member in the libraries and who is sort of the resident expert on WSU history. He has a lot to say about that, and he did not hesitate when I asked him. I said, "Would you mind just in your spare time, you think about this and come back to me?" He didn't even think about it, come back to me. He immediately said Ida Lou Anderson, and he told me her story. So just a couple of the highlights. First of all, Ida Lou Anderson was born in Colfax, and she contracted polio as a child, and when she was 9 years old, and suffered from that, really excruciating treatments, and had a lot of pain, years where she could not walk. But she really was determined and attended Washington State College in the 1920s. And received a degree and went on to get a master's in speech from the University of Chicago, and then came back to teach at Washington State College in 1926. That was her first year of teaching, and she taught from 1926 to 1939. In her first year, she had a student named Egbert Murrow, who later changed his name to Edward. And he signed up for her class in radio broadcasting. She went on to have him in 19 of her speech courses. And the two of them became apparently sort of famous on the campus for walking up and down what was later called the Terrell Mall and discussing everything from poetry to philosophy to the arts. Him being quite tall, apparently, and she was a very diminutive figure. Edward R. Murrow came to WSU because it was one of the few radio broadcasting programs in the country at the time, and one of the few colleges or universities that had a radio station located on the campus. She influenced numbers and dozens of students, although of course Edward R. Murrow being the most famous. And she retired in 1939. Apparently the challenges physically really got to her. She was only 40 years old at that time. And when she retired, President Holland wrote to her in 1940 and said, "You've been one of the most valuable members of our faculty, recognized not only by students, but also by the faculty itself. I have told members of the Board of Regents on many occasions of your splendid influence on students majoring in speech and others enrolled in the institution." She undoubtedly, Holland was president from 1916 to 1944. And so she undoubtedly was part of many of the faculty events that he held in that residence, which is really just a fabulous constellation. When she passed, then in 1941, Murrow decided to send $350 to President Holland to pay for the publication of her memoirs. And Murrow wrote in that letter, "We have been in the presence of one who was, in the true sense of the word, greater than anyone we had met or were ever likely to meet." Really strong endorsement from Murrow. The final piece of information, which we did not get to add to your packet, but super exciting. Christina Peterson-Wilson, my chief of staff, has been on a mission to identify any potential family members of Ida Lou Anderson. She passed at 41 years of age. She did not have children herself. Initially, we couldn't find any family members in Colfax, and she obviously didn't have any direct descendants, but we wanted to see if there were family members. We don't want to name something after someone if there are living family members. So she tracked down a great nephew of Ida Lou Anderson's. His name is Bill Plaskett. He lives in Malibu, California. She spoke to him twice regarding the potential renaming of the residence. Mr. Plaskett is Ms. Anderson's great nephew. And in the conversations, it's appropriate, I'm reading from Christina's message, it's appropriate to qualify Mr. Plaskett's reaction to the potential renaming as honored and grateful. His father, also Bill Plaskett, and Ms. Anderson were very close during his upbringing in Pullman. Mr. Plaskett recalls countless fond memories shared by his father. His father and Ms. Anderson are buried together in the Colfax graveyard. Mr. Plaskett also mentioned that he owns numerous telegrams and letters between Ms. Anderson and Edward R. Murrow. Mr. Plaskett is preparing photos of those to send to Trevor Bond. If the Board of Regents passes the renaming of the residence, Mr. Plaskett would be delighted to join the formal renaming celebration, ideally next spring. And he was grateful that we located him and informed him of the potential change. So please let me know if you have any further questions. And Stacy, I don't know if you want to add anything since you are the chair of the committee who reviewed this.
Yes, as chair of the Facilities Names Committee, this was just thrilling to get this recommendation and read about that history. So the committee strongly endorsed this and President Schultz has approved it. So now it's in your hands.
Bruce is with us.
Oh, hi, Bruce.
Hello.
Yes,
I just wanted to join for the vote and add my endorsement. It's quite meaningful. And one of the things that I enjoy so much about this story is it uniquely belongs to WSU. And we can see the influence of one professor literally impacting world history through her student. And Ida Lou Anderson and Murrow stayed in touch throughout his career. As a matter of fact, she continued to mentor him until her death. So it's really a remarkable story. So I very much appreciate your willingness to consider this renaming.
And just for the record, this will be an action item that will come before the board for consideration at tomorrow's Board of Regents meeting. Are there any other comments or questions for either Chancellor Chilton or for Stacy Pearson?
I would just like to, not just, everybody knows of my endorsement, but as we talked about doing this, I just can't, we hit the ball out of the park so much on the name, the story, all those kind of things. I mean, we could have come up with some deserving names. Everybody would have gone, yeah, that's kind of nice, but this is stunning. And I just think when students come over now to the house, and we have some displays and things that tell this story, it's just, to me, it all fits in such a wonderful way. So it's hard to believe a disabled female faculty member in the 30s influencing notably one of our top 2 or 3 graduates from Washington State University. You just can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's stunning. So I appreciate Trevor Bond bringing this forward, Bruce's support and others. I've told everybody I know about this story, including presidents and chancellors at other institutions. They're like, that is so cool, because almost everybody's heard of Edward R. Murrow. And anyway, so well done, just by the whole team.
As someone who always appreciates great storytelling, this is a great story. We should do something from the university standpoint to get the story out there as you get this.
Yep.
Named the
absolutely.
building.
Would love
It's
to
a
do
good
that.
story.
Maybe by a Hall of Famer.
There you go.
So stunning, and it's so inspirational. And it sort of makes me think, do we have any other gems out there that we haven't found yet?
Yeah. Well,
'Cause-
I'm sure there are. I mean, if this is what Trevor came up with without even blinking,
Yeah.
imagine what he could come up with if he took, half an hour. So, I appreciate your support too, Bruce. I came to Bruce and I'm like, would it be okay with you if we explored this? And I don't think you really hesitated much on that. But I do want to use this opportunity to dig into the campus history and really uncover a number of these gems as we really think through the formation of the Pullman campus identity. Think about its history, think about really how we've grown, how it's changed over the past 130 years, but also remember the past as it influences the present. So
Good. I think I see some of Elizabeth's academic training showing up here. Some unearthing going on.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
I really do hope we do something to really to tell this story, to get it out there beyond just the university, because it's a really good story.
So
And it's just,
it's part of my goals. We provided Phil and his team with extra financial resources to be able to pick 4 or 5 kind of key things, and he and his team be able to work together with folks, not just do it overnight. This clearly is going to fall into the kind of category where we really would like to do something, and we have the financial resources identified to do it. So I think that's going to be a fun part of all this, and we'll certainly want board engagement and ideas you might have around not just the ribbon cutting in the house, but how to really tell this fantastic story around it. So
make a good video piece.
Yeah, certainly would. And I also, of course, had a question, and from a fundraising standpoint of, obviously you've connected with this one descendant, but I imagine there may be others, and I'm assuming that we've gone into ancestry.com or whatever to make sure we're not forgetting to uncover other relatives. And
Thanks for that question. Christina has been working on online searches for quite some time, since we first thought of this idea. I'm trying to remember when we first came to this. It was a while ago. It was certainly
6 months ago.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And so this was my first question, because, people could, for some reason, either be offended, or certainly you don't want to have people surprised that you're naming someone. She could have had, an aunt living right there in Colfax or something.
Right.
So she believes that he is the last living relative from that line of her family. And when she spoke to him, she asked him point blank. She said, "I believe you are the last living relative. Is that so?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am."
Okay.
He still owns some farmland in Colfax that is not currently under cultivation, but they still do own a piece of land, although they moved to California at some point, and so his branch of the family has not lived there. We'll continue to document that, though. When she first called him up, he thought that she was, a solicitor or something. And he said, what do you want?
Yeah.
And then when he found out what it was about, he was quite delighted.
Yeah. those are
But as far as we
weird
know,
calls to get, yeah.
yeah, he
Okay.
is it. He is it. And, I'm going to try to scrape together the funds to fly him out because, this is something that is an honor for us as much as it is for him.
Right. And then obviously the extended Murrow family too. I mean, this relates to their story. So
Yeah,
getting
that's-
them involved as well.
That's right. Yeah, well, I'll work with you on that one, Bruce.
So Elizabeth, it would have been easy to just say, this is the president's house and that's the chancellor's house. And instead, I think you really took the moment to create something really special. And I appreciate your leadership. So this is going to be just an outstanding moment and a legacy that you're leaving and helping to honor her legacy as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
I'll
And
just
I
say
think-
thank you. What a wonderful way to celebrate what faculty do. Much appreciated.
I think this is an excellent way to end the Strategic and Operational Excellence Committee meeting. It's been a great, I would like to thank our presenters again for their awesome presentations, and thank you both for landing on a wonderful outcome for the naming of the President's House. So this concludes us, and we will now, the Regents will be adjourning for lunch, and we will reconvene at 1 p.m. We'll see you all.